I'm Summer el-Shahat, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business, economics and finance. This week, we look back at the year that was. Just when we thought the worst of the financial crisis was over, the Eurozone bails out two of its members with the help of the International Monetary Fund. And the crisis of confidence looks set to continue into next year. A debt crisis here in Europe and a debt problem on the other side of the pond. With a jobless recovery, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke resorts to yet more quantitative easing. All this as Asia's new tigers power ahead. But will inflation and asset bubbles be their undoing? To discuss these issues further, I'm joined by Jan Randolph, the head of sovereign debt at IHS Global Insights, and Deutsche Bank's chief economist Thomas Mayer. Gentlemen, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. Now, there's one thing we do know, that 2011 is going to be a big year for the Eurozone countries. They are going to have to go to the markets to get more money, to the tune of something like $740 billion. Some are saying that many other countries, particularly Portugal, might end up also being bailed out. Jan, do you think that's likely?
Yeah, it's a 50-50 situation, and I think it's more important than just whether Portugal's going to be the next domino and whether that's going to knock on to Spain. The real issue for the markets and investors is, have the European authorities, ECB, Eurozone governments, have they actually got a grip of the situation? Can they implement something that can stop this drama lurching from crisis to crisis? You know, there's more cliffhanging moments here than Desperate Housewives. You know, is it going to go on to 2011? You know,
that's a very good point. And Thomas, I mean, in many ways, European leaders are dealing with the problem of the banks and of Europe as one of liquidity, of a lack of cash, but not one of insolvency. Many of these countries are insolvent, and many of the banks are also insolvent. Isn't that the core of the problem?
Well, if I may correct you in one thing, I wouldn't say that many are insolvent. Some of the countries may be insolvent, because if many were insolvent, we would have a real problem. But you're quite right. The market has become very uneasy if you treat a liquidity problem if you treat a solvency problem as a liquidity issue and you pump more money into the system. So that has not been reassuring. Now, towards the end of October, you know, the authorities made a U-turn. They acknowledged that there might be solvency issues, and that is why they opened up the possibility of having debt restructurings in the future. But that was communicated in a rather awkward way. They said it might happen in the future, but it was unclear how, and it was not clear how to get there. It was a bit like, you know, you have a patient and you tell this patient you need a serious operation. You wheel him in the operating room, and the doctor, meanwhile, is studying the manual on how to do it. So people freaked out.
But why has that been so much the character of how the Europeans have dealt with this problem? I mean, they almost have to be kind of dragged, kicking and screaming to do something about it. Why is that?
Yeah, I think the original designers behind the euro knew there were these structural issues. I mean, at the time, many economists have said you can't have a proper proper currency union without a fiscal union. That means closer political union. But they left it. You know, they said we'll deal with the problem when it comes, and now it has come, and they think they can fix the aircraft halfway in flight. You know, with this sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. It's the way the euro's been. No, it's a work in progress, and you know, it does have these structural issues theoretically, but so does an aircraft. An aircraft has structural limits, but we happily get on board most of the time, and these things fly most of the time.
The price that many people are paying, whether in Ireland or whether in Greece, because of these incredible austerity measures, is huge. And the point is, can we continue forcing people to pay these incredible price?
Well, up to a point, I would say. I mean, we should also not forget that a lot of these countries, and here I think it's really a lot, have had a wonderful credit party during the last 10 years, and they have overdone it. But I would want to come back what the previous speaker said. I think there was a structural flaw in the construction of EMU, and it was a flaw that already showed up in the 1920s gold standard, which was in a sense a kind of a predecessor of the EMU, where we fixed exchange rate together, you know, irrevocably. And it turned out after the stock market crash of 29 that you lacked a mechanism in the middle to manage a funding crisis, to manage adjustment programs. And because of that lesson out of the gold standard, in the post-World War II dollar standard, John Maynard Keynes and others created the International Monetary Fund. Now, in a sense, it is astonishing that when you set up EMU that you did not heed this lesson. So they lack this mechanism that now they need to create in the midst of a crisis.
It seems as though we are actually building one now.
Yeah,
This treasury, and it's interesting because it's almost as if the European Union is going to develop its own kind of IMF with IMF facilities, and even talking about contingency lines of credit now.
But isn't still the core of the problem is that ultimately you have countries at different and differing levels of development put together. It's almost like putting primary school kids with PhD students. You've got Germany, this very strong economy with these other periphery economies, and many have said that in many ways it's been very unfair for the Irish and Greek economies. Yes, they went on a debt binge, but they also have paid a very high price in relation to their competitiveness, for example.
I think one of the things that happened under the euro, and we mustn't forget the euro has been terribly successful, certainly in the first stage of the crisis, as a safe harbour for these smaller countries. They were shielded, whereas 20 years ago we would have a traditional balance of payments crisis and defaults already. So we're in the second stage, a little bit more difficult stage. Currency union doesn't solve the credit risk issues you have, whether it's public sector or private sector. But yes, in one sense, what the Eurozone hasn't done, it hasn't actually done this real convergence. We have these imbalances within the Eurozone. We talk about global imbalances, very large structural surplus exporters and others with structural deficits as the complement to that. And they exist within the Eurozone. But that's been a bit of a taboo subject. And I think in terms of oversight, there's been too much of a fetish looking at the public sector and not enough on imbalances, oversized banking systems developing in the private sector.
I mean, that's very true. I mean, very much we went after government debt and did not look at the banking debt that exists. I mean, the heart of this right now is a banking problem that's become a sovereign debt problem. A sovereign debt problem has become a banking debt problem.
Well, I mean, that certainly applies for Ireland, that applies for Spain, which actually, always passed the test of the Stability and Growth Pact with flying colors. It's different for Greece. They really had a public sector debt problem. I would think it's also probably different for Portugal. So you have both ways, a banking sector issue and a public sector issue. But you're quite right when you say that when we talk about the debt crisis, we are only talking half of the story. The other half is the divergence and the cost competitiveness differences.
Absolutely.
But I would say it's also not necessarily spelling the end of the euro. You can live with such big divergences, and you want to have a living proof that you can do this. Think of Italy. Italy has a very dynamic, industrial, powerful north. It has a very weak south, and it's a center that is in between, right?
It's a very impoverished south as well, but the point is, how long can we go? In many ways, Germany is benefiting from the euro overwhelmingly, and German competitiveness being built upon having a labour or workers that are not paid so much. So how could Greece and Ireland then compete? I mean, that will remain, that will stay, surely, no?
Well, I mean, if you look at Italy, I mean, Italy has held since Garibaldi, and the differences were there. So my point is, you can manage, but
yes,
you need a
where's the
strong
dynamism?
commitment.
But where then will be the dynamism out of that?
I think for this decade, the rest of this decade, it will be in the core, and the periphery will probably very, very downbeat.
Okay, so in 2011, do you think we will still have the same members in the euro as they are?
Yes, it's well, we know for a fact there will actually be one new member on the 1st of January, so the Eurozone is actually expanding despite all this drama, and there may yet be more. I mean, it is. I think there's. We talk about the focus is very much on the negative at the moment, understandably, because of the issues about commitment, particularly from the German side, and also what the impact of austerity is. I mean, without growth, there are real solvency issues, and growth is required to get to grow out of the problem, and this is particularly difficult on the periphery, where austerity is what is required. I mean that is that's the touchstone policy set by Berlin at the moment, and at the moment Berlin's unashamedly for once in the driving seat after all these decades. And if they are going to make the commitments, I suspect they will have to. They will probably want to have even greater influence on policy. But yes, I mean we need growth on the periphery. One of the things that could happen next year quite easily, for example, with the new Irish government coming in, the opposition's already said that they want senior bondholders involved in sharing the costs of the banking system crash. Why should it be the taxpayers? And that's actually putting what Berlin wants, although Berlin typically wants it in legal terms in an ordered fashion, German style, rather than on the hoof now. Ireland wanting the senior bondholders to share in the costs of the bailout.
Jan, thank you very much, but we're going to have to stop there for a break. But when we return, I'll be asking the question of what's really wrong with default. Argentina did it, and guess what? It was sitting at the G20 table. That's next. Welcome back to Counting the Cost here on Al Jazeera. I'm joined in the studio by Deutsche Bank's Chief Economist, Thomas Mayer, and Jan Randolph, the Head of Sovereign Debt at IHS Global Insights. Now, Thomas, let me come back to this point. What's really wrong with default? I mean, many people would argue that default is the best thing for the Greek people right now.
Well, I mean, it's never pleasant to go into default, but sometimes it's unavoidable, right? And if you can't carry your debt, I think it's good to take a break, restructure the whole thing and start afresh. And I think you cannot exclude that there one or the other country in EMU where that is probably necessary. Because, as we just discussed, the growth outlook for some of the regions is rather dismal. The debt run up through the credit part is very high, so maybe there is no alternative.
But if there is default, what will be the impact on particularly the German and French banks holding so much of the sovereign debt of these countries?
The difference really is, and there's a big continuum of default. There's soft default and running away from your debts. It's a question whether it's orderly or not. And what I suspect Berlin really is getting at now is this idea that there are irresponsible borrowers, yes, and they could be both public and private. But there's also irresponsible lenders on the other side of that coin. And both have to be held to account. I think that is the main idea behind the debt restructuring mechanisms that's coming in, where they're trying to introduce this idea of bondholders coming in or creditors coming in to share in the burden. It cannot always be taxpayers. And there's a tremendous, if we think back to the crisis, there's been tremendous popular anger about the way in which governments have been held blackmailed even by very large banking systems because they haven't done all the investments properly, and they hold the rest of the economy and therefore the government and taxpayers to ransom to pick up all the pieces. That's not on. And I think Angela Merkel wants to try and create a financial system that is safer and where risks are taken and they're lost, that they share in the burden of carrying the can. It can't always be the taxpayer carrying the can for failed banks or failed banking system.
That's very true. And I want to move now to America because America has survived its banking crisis. It still has an economic crisis. Why has America been able to do that and Europe not?
Well, if you are sure of your central bank, if you can command your central bank to come to help you, you're always safe as a government because you can always fund yourself from your central bank. Now, if you have a system in which you have one central bank that is owned by 16 governments, they can't agree how much help eventually they can demand from the central bank. Some would say nothing. That's the German position. We don't want the central bank to step in and just buy up the government debt. And others would say they should buy everything. So for the US, it's fairly easy. For these 16 countries to come to an agreement on how far you can throw the ECB into the fire, it's extremely difficult.
Now, there was huge fears about America entering a double-dip recession mid-year. In many ways, these fears have evaporated, but there are still some people who are arguing that America is bankrupt. So who's got it right?
I think we could be very careful about using words like insolvent and bankruptcy, particularly when it comes to governments, because solvency, sovereign insolvency, sovereign default and insolvency, really, they don't go bankrupt in the same way as people, banks or corporates. They just stop paying. They continue to grow the carrots and make the machines and so on. The traffic lights still work. It's a different kind of default. But America is, its public debt levels are going up. On some measures, it's no different from Greece. But America is America. It is still 1/4 of the global economy. It has the reserve currency. It has this this very activist, certainly in the German mind, very active, hyperactive in the German mind, central bank.
It's true with all its quantitative easing that it's pushing through now, 600 billion.
And the blurring of fiscal and monetary policy.
On top of 800 that you already have done.
800. Now, do you think that's been working? I mean, the quantitative easing, do you think that's been working, or do you think, it's going to end in tears?
Yeah, I think it's at this stage it's working on the margin. The Fed did a very good job last year. When the financial markets come up, you need to give them liquidity. But what they're now trying to do, they're trying to throw money at a problem that they can't control with monetary policy, which is the high unemployment rate. I think a lot of it is structural, and if you just pump money in, what you'll do is you'll eventually weaken your currency. And you may be able to keep your bond yields low by intervening. They did this after World War II, incidentally. We had a 30-year treasury yield of 2.5% for 6 years, with inflation averaging 5%. So you can get that done, but you then, in a floating exchange rate system, you can't keep your currency.
Now, it's interesting you bring up this whole issue of the exchange rate, because America has been very critical of China over supposedly what it sees as it undervaluing its yuan, but at the same time, through quantitative easing, as we've just heard, they're doing something pretty similar, no?
Yeah, the Germans have pointed out that, it may not be the intention of this quantitative easing to weaken the dollar. It's certainly a consequence unless, of course, the Eurozone crisis. It's a very tricky one to work out where the dollar and the euro will be at this time next year. It's very 50-50. We've got the quantitative easing, and then we've got the Eurozone crisis. And,
so probably don't go anywhere.
It's we had this situation of unstable equilibrium. Counteracting forces perfectly matched, and we could well see that. But and so in a sense, at the end of the day, though, America, with its central bank, if it wants to have a weaker dollar, it will get a weaker dollar. It's for the rest of the world to choose the terms of surrender in this, no matter how bad the Eurozone crisis gets.
But it is quite scary for some of these emerging market economies that suddenly they're seeing all these dollars coming their way. That could cause huge troubles for them, no?
Well, this is the problem, because as long as they try to manage their exchange rate against the US dollar, they're importing a hugely easy monetary policy for their conditions, hugely easy. If you look at a country like China, growing this year real terms, 10%, 3.5% inflation, so nominal 14%, you would expect nominal rates to be double-digit, right? Well, they're still very, 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 very low, so real rates are brutally negative. So that is the problem, and I think eventually they will conclude that they will have to let the exchange rate go up a bit more so that they can actually delink themselves from the super easy monetary policy of the US, in their own interest, right? Not to please the Americans, but in their own interest.
But I suppose what's been quite fascinating at this stage of the crisis is that we're seeing in many ways a true decoupling taking place from the big economies from the Western Hemisphere. Yes, at the beginning of the crisis, everyone was saying there will be decoupling. It didn't happen. But now we're really seeing it. Asia is roaring ahead.
It's an interesting concept there. And we went through this at the peak of the boom in 2007. I do believe in some sort of concept of contingent decoupling. The idea that, for example, countries with massive surpluses and massive financial resources like China are able to buy their way, spend their way into a high level of growth, while the West is still basically trying to pick itself up off its feet, which it is, except for Germany, which has unusually got industrial policy perfectly nailed. Sell machines to emerging markets and high-end consumer goods to the West, and it's done very well out of that policy. So there is one exception in the West here. But yes, we got the situation where this year and next year we've got emerging markets powering ahead, effectively keeping the global economy afloat, and important new sources of demand for European and American exporters. The issue of the exchange rates is very interesting here, because America obviously wants to doesn't want to, and is not able to use its households, its middle classes, to power the next global upswing, because either they're too stretched or because it doesn't want to have these big imbalances, because it's now learned the consequences of that. And so it wants to have a bigger export driver, and that means more consumption driver in Asia.
But it's true, but it's going to take China a fair bit before it allows its own citizens to actually start consuming a great deal of their own goods, let's say. So these imbalances are going to be with us for a while.
Well, but they're making very determined effort to rebalance the economy. When you look at their new 5-year plan, the emphasis is really very strongly on strengthening domestic demand. There is now a tolerance of significant wage increases. There is a policy to shift economic activity away from the coast side, where there's a lot of exporting taking place towards the inner part of the country. I think they have really realized, that they have to change in order to remain the same, a fast-growing economy.
So looking forward, Thomas, your predictions for 2011, what are they?
I think we will see moderate growth in the industrial world. We see continued strong growth in the emerging market world. We will struggle with the debt problem, but we will not see a euro area blow up. And in the course of the year, the focus will shift on the American situation, which is the only country where we have a full-blown fiscal expansion, a full-blown monetary expansion, and people will wonder where this will end.
Jan?
Yeah, okay, quick forecast next year. I mean, certainly I think recoveries in most areas will gain wider traction. Not to full health. I think we'll still have issues in banking systems and debt issues in Europe. It'd be a very interesting drama to watch, and what cliffhanging moments we'll see next year. And ultimately what the German position is, what they're prepared to basically underwrite, in what form and fashion and according to what rules. I think there'll be some real issues of overheating in emerging markets. We're seeing that increasingly, economies like India and there are others, real overheating symptoms, not just bubbles and markets, but serious economic overheating because of the capital flow issues that we talked about earlier. I don't think the Eurozone will have some sort of bust up. I think even in the very, very worst case scenario, we might see some political movement emerge in these austerity-driven economies on the fringes, like in Ireland, changing the terms of making it more difficult. But there's no serious politician, even in the periphery of Europe, actually arguing for de-Euroization. I think people outside the Euro fail to appreciate that.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Jan Randolph, Thomas Mayer, thank you both for joining me. But just before we go, I should tell you that given the importance of China to the global economy, we have found out that 2011 is going to be a year of the rabbit in the Chinese calendar. And that's supposedly good news for markets, as rabbit years are meant to bring us peace, calm and respite from this year's dramas. Well, here's hoping. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. Don't forget you can catch us online and on Twitter. But for the time being, from me, Summer, el-Shahat and the rest of the team here, thanks for watching and bye-bye.